I saw the blood on my father's shirt before I even heard the gunshot. The smell hit me first. A coppery metallic tang that made my stomach twist. My father stumbled toward me, his hands trembling as he tried to push me behind the car. I could hear his shallow breaths, ragged, like he was trying to fight against something I couldn't see yet. And then the blast tore through our little street in South Boston, so loud it felt like it had ripped the roof off the world. For a moment everything froze. The autumn leaves hung suspended in the air as if they had stopped mid-fall. The night, which had been calm, our block quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic, was shattered. The windows of our neighbors' houses rattled, but no one came outside. Not a single soul. Boston has that way about it. People mind their own business. Gunshots pierce the air, and they shut their windows and pretend the world outside isn't happening. And then I saw her. Melanie Wade. My mother's closest friend. Someone I had trusted more than anyone outside my family. She was standing there, the barrel of a gun pointed directly at my father, her eyes wide and wild, full of rage and something darker that I would come to recognize later. Pure calculation. I screamed for help, my voice cracking raw with terror. But no help came. The echo of my voice bounced off the brick buildings and disappeared into the night. Only the sound of sirens in the distance, muted and late, answered me. My father tried to shield me with his body. He stumbled and I grabbed him, trying to keep him upright. His hands were trembling against mine. And through the panic, I remember his eyes locking onto mine, filled with fear, but also with warning. "She's not who you think she is," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She wants everything, even you." And then he collapsed. I felt a surge of cold panic run through me, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stay on my feet. I looked around, desperate, searching for anyone at all who might intervene. But the street was empty. The faint glow from the street lamps illuminated Melanie's silhouette. She was calm now, almost eerily so, surveying the chaos she had created. My father, my protector, was lying on the ground, bleeding, and I was completely exposed. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But my mind froze. I had never experienced fear like this before, not in my worst nightmares. This was different. This was reality. The kind of terror that burrows under your skin and sets up residence, refusing to leave. Melanie advanced slowly, deliberately, each step measured. Her gun still aimed, her face a mask of control. I could see the subtle twitch of her jaw, the way her eyes darted to the side, scanning for anyone who might interrupt her plan. And that's when it hit me, she had thought this through. Every detail. Every escape route. Every contingency. I realized then that nothing I had ever known about her had been real. Every smile, every friendly word, every shared laugh with my mother, it had been a lie. I remember crouching low, my hands pressed against my father's chest, feeling the wet warmth seeping through my fingers. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would burst. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Why? Why him? Why my family? Why me? I screamed again, louder this time, my voice cracking. But the neighbors just beyond the fence did nothing. The air was filled with tension so thick I could taste it. The world had narrowed to this moment, this one person, this one act of betrayal. Melanie slammed a stack of papers on the hood of our car. A chaotic mix of forged documents, bills, and what I would later learn were deeds to our family property. "Sign," she commanded, her voice icy and sharp, "or you'll watch everything fall apart. Everything you love. Everything you are." I refused. And then she struck me. Not with the gun, but with the metal stapler sitting on the hood. It hit me across the face and I fell to my knees. The metallic taste of blood mingled with the dirt beneath me. Pain exploded through my skull, sharp and insistent, demanding attention. I wanted to fight back, but I was paralyzed, stunned by disbelief and shock. I saw her eyes, calm, cold, predatory. No remorse. No hesitation. Just the certainty of someone who knew they could take everything and had no intention of stopping. She kicked me once hard and I slid across the gravel. The papers scattered like leaves in the wind, fluttering out of reach. And then she was gone. Gone. Just like that. The sound of her heels on the pavement fading into the distance. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the sirens finally arriving too late, my body shaking uncontrollably. I cradled my father, whispering reassurances I didn't even feel. I couldn't think beyond the sheer weight of betrayal, the injustice, the emptiness that had suddenly engulfed my life. That night changed everything. Not just my family, not just my home, but me. I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. And I also knew I would spend the rest of my life searching for answers, hunting the person who had stolen not just my family, but my sense of safety, my trust, my very future. What would you have done if someone you trusted turned against your family in the most terrifying way imaginable? I woke up the next morning to the bitter smell of coffee that wasn't mine and the sharp tang of antiseptic in my father's study. His office had always been his sanctuary, a place where the world made sense in numbers and ledgers, but now it smelled of blood and betrayal. Every corner held reminders of the chaos from the night before. The papers Melanie had thrown across the hood of the car were gone, swept away like she had never been there. But I knew better. I knew exactly what had been taken. I remember shivering as I walked from room to room, touching the edges of furniture my father had restored with his own hands. It was tangible proof of the life she had stolen. And then I saw it. The faint scuff mark on the corner of the desk where she had struck me with the stapler. My fingers traced the mark slowly. I could still feel the sting on my face from the blow, and my mind played the night over and over. Boston felt different that morning. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I walked outside expecting to see someone, neighbors, police, anyone. But the world had already moved on. The gunshot, the screaming, the chaos, all swallowed by the indifferent hum of the city. That's the Boston I remember. People hear but they don't act. They see but they don't intervene. I called the police, of course. Twice. And both times, I felt the familiar wave of frustration and dismissal that older Americans know too well. The authorities listened politely, took notes, and filed the report under domestic dispute. No urgency. No hint of the truth I knew in my bones. Melanie had vanished without a trace, leaving behind an invisible trail of destruction. I found myself searching my father's safe, the one place I hadn't looked in my panic. Inside were old letters, property deeds, and a stack of ledgers, hidden notes my father had kept over decades. One letter stood out. It was addressed to my mother, in handwriting I recognized immediately, deliberate, precise, and deceptively kind. Everything must be in order. If you fail, Evelyn will pay the price for your mistakes. My stomach dropped. That was the first time I realized she had been planning this for months, maybe years. Every smile, every friendly word with my mother, every laugh, they had been carefully orchestrated. Every act of kindness a mask for manipulation and greed. I remember pacing the apartment that morning, running my hands through my hair, trying to make sense of it. Fear clawed at me, but it wasn't the only thing. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, thick and hot, promising a reckoning I didn't yet know how to achieve. I began to piece together what she had stolen. The small furniture store my father co-owned in Dorchester, the property on the corner of Broad Street, the modest savings account meant for my college tuition, all vanished. And worst of all, my father's reputation, built over decades of honest work, had been shredded overnight. I spent that day talking to anyone I could find. Neighbors, former colleagues, the elderly man who had lived across the street for 40 years. He leaned heavily on his cane, squinting at me through tired eyes, and whispered almost reverently, "Your father trusted her too much. Love makes fools of us all. She's clever, and she doesn't care who she hurts." I realized then that my fight was just beginning, not against the authorities who saw only paperwork and formalities, but against a woman whose cunning had allowed her to disappear, leaving chaos in her wake. Every lead I chased that day was like walking through fog. Every name, every address led to dead ends or people too afraid to speak. But I remember looking out the window at the Boston skyline that evening, the Charles River reflecting the dying light of the sun, and I made a vow to myself. A vow that would shape the next 20 years of my life. I will find her. No matter how long it takes. No matter where she hides in this country. I will make her answer for what she did to my family. And as the night fell, I sat at my father's desk, running my hands over the letters and ledgers, feeling the weight of a life stolen but not yet forgotten. I could still hear the echo of the gunshot in my ears, still feel the sting of the stapler across my cheek, still smell the metallic tang of betrayal in the air. It was more than fear. It was a call to action. And I knew that to pursue Melanie Wade I would have to change too. become stronger, smarter, sharper, patient. I would have to follow her trail across this country, through every city she touched, every life she disrupted, until the moment I faced her again. If someone stole everything from you overnight, would you forgive, hide, or fight back? The days after that night bled into one another like gray water down Boston's cobblestone streets. The city I had known so well, the narrow alleyways of South Boston, the familiar honk of the T trains, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakeries, had become a landscape of loss. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of what Melanie had taken, what the night had stolen from me, and what my father had left behind. I didn't just lose a home or a family that night. I lost a sense of safety I had never questioned. I lost trust. I lost my innocence. And for a time I lost myself. The foster care system became my new world. I was moved from one small apartment to another, each overseen by strangers who wore kindness like a mask but seemed always distracted by the chaos of their own lives. I remember lying awake at night in the dim light of a single lamp, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, thinking of my father and that single whispered warning. She wants everything, even you. The words echoed in my head, haunting every step I took. I had never truly understood the weight of them until then. It wasn't just about property, money, or reputation. It was about control, about power, about someone deciding that my life, my choices, my happiness, all of it, could be stolen with a single act of violence. I learned quickly that in a world that had already taken so much, I had to take what I could control. I buried myself in school, in learning, in small victories that reminded me I could still exist beyond fear. In Boston, older neighborhoods like Dorchester and Quincy had a stubborn, steady rhythm to them. I wandered the streets in the evenings after classes, watching the children play, the elderly couples walk together, the corner stores light up their neon signs. Life continued despite tragedy, and somehow I clung to that. I found solace in books. The bookstore near Harvard Square became my sanctuary. Its shelves smelled of paper, ink, and time, of lives lived, stories told, and wisdom passed down through generations. Older customers shared quiet advice, stories of their own regrets, their triumphs, their moments of clarity. I listened, learning not just about the world but about the patience and cunning it took to survive it. They didn't know the darkness I carried, and I didn't tell them. But every word they spoke became a brick in the foundation I was rebuilding for myself. I also worked odd jobs. Assistant at a small law firm, receptionist at a medical office, sometimes delivering letters and packages. Every role I took was about survival and learning. I started piecing together patterns of human behavior, studying how people manipulate, deceive, and sometimes betray. It wasn't academic at first, it was personal. Every day, I reminded myself of Melanie Wade, of the night that had defined my life, and of the vow I whispered to the quiet Boston night as the sirens faded. I will find her. No matter how long it takes. No matter where she hides in this country. I will make her answer for what she did to my family. That promise became my compass. It shaped the choices I made, the friendships I kept, and the knowledge I sought. I studied criminal psychology at Boston University, not because I wanted a career in the field, but because I needed to understand her mind, the woman who had destroyed everything. I pored over case studies of fraud, manipulation, and violent behavior. I memorized patterns, red flags, and psychological profiles. Every late night at the library, every annotation in the margins of books, was a step closer to understanding the person who had upended my life. And yet I was still human. I laughed. I cried. I made friends. I discovered that resilience doesn't mean abandoning joy. It means carrying your pain and using it as fuel rather than a shackle. I remember wandering along the Charles River, watching the sun glint off the water, the university students rowing, the city skyline etched against the sky. The world kept moving and I kept moving with it, even when I wanted to stop. There were nights when the memories of that night, the gun, my father, Melanie's eyes, would invade my dreams. I would wake up shaking, my heart pounding, the smell of gunpowder still faint on my pillow. But I used those moments too, letting them remind me why I couldn't stop, why I couldn't forgive, why patience, cunning, and strategy would be my weapons. I began to document everything I could remember. Every encounter, every detail, every misstep Melanie had made, and every clue that might someday lead me to her. I filled notebooks with timelines, maps, and theories. Boston became a living archive in my mind. The streets she had walked, the businesses she had frequented, the houses she had visited. Every corner held a memory, a hint, or a trap. I walked those streets repeatedly, retracing steps from my childhood, from the night she struck, from every interaction I had remembered. The slow accumulation of wisdom, the patient plodding, the understanding that life's most important battles aren't won with brute force, but with strategy, foresight, and emotional endurance. By the time I graduated, I had changed. Not entirely healed, but sharper. Not entirely safe, but stronger. And I had a plan, a promise burned into my bones. Melanie Wade would not escape me forever. The United States is a big place, but no one can hide from determination. Especially when it is fueled by the kind of pain that older people know all too well. Loss, betrayal, and the lingering ache of injustice. That was when I understood that rebuilding myself wasn't just about survival. It was about preparing for the day I would finally confront her. And I carried that thought everywhere. In the crowded subway cars of Boston, the quiet corners of libraries, the empty streets at night. It became my mantra, my shield, and my weapon. I still remember the last night I spent in my father's apartment before leaving for college, the smell of his old books, the faint stain of the blood he had left on the carpet, the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. I whispered to myself one final time, "I will find you, Melanie, even if it takes my whole life." And with that, I walked into a Boston night that felt both familiar and alien, carrying only the memory of what I had lost, and the unwavering promise of what I would reclaim. Do you think patience and strategy are more powerful than raw strength? Years had passed, but every detail of that night in South Boston was etched into my memory with the precision of a shuttered photograph. The way the gun gleamed in her hand, the weight of my father's body against mine, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, the echo of sirens that came too late. Boston, which had once been my home, felt smaller with each passing year. I wandered its streets like a ghost, retracing old steps, running my fingers along familiar brick walls, inhaling the cold air that carried the scent of the Charles River. Every street corner, every alleyway, every corner store felt like a breadcrumb leading back to the woman who had stolen everything from me. But then, one evening in late October, I found my first real lead outside the city. I had been scouring old Boston news archives, scrolling through microfilm at the Boston Public Library, when a small clipping caught my eye. The words were innocuous at first. Arrest in Atlanta for white-collar fraud. But as I read, a chill ran down my spine. The description of the woman, the height, the hair color, the eyes, matched Melanie Wade perfectly. My pulse raced, my hands shook. After all these years, there she was. A crack in the wall, a shadow that I could finally see. I booked the first train to Atlanta. I didn't sleep on the journey. The train rattled through the darkened landscape of the Northeast, carrying me farther and farther from the city I had once called home. I clutched my notebook filled with timelines, maps, and theories, feeling a strange mixture of fear, anticipation, and grim determination. Atlanta was different from Boston. The streets were wide, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and wet asphalt. The traffic roared like a river, and the people moved with an energy I wasn't used to. But amidst the unfamiliarity, I could still see her. I could imagine her walking these streets, blending into the crowd, smiling at the wrong people, always one step ahead. I visited the court records, spoke to neighbors, even the officer who had worked her case. She had been released under a new name, Marlene Wyatt. The world was giving her a second chance, but she hadn't forgotten what she had done, and neither had I. The first time I saw her in person, it was from a distance. I followed her to a small cafe on Peachtree Street, watching her move with the same confidence I remembered from Boston. She smiled at strangers, laughed at jokes, ordered coffee with precision. She was unremarkable to anyone else. To me, she was a predator, perfectly disguised as a human being. I spent days in Atlanta, interviewing everyone who had seen her, piecing together her patterns. Each conversation added another layer of detail. She had been living quietly, working small jobs, volunteering at local charities. No one suspected the magnitude of her past crimes. She had a knack for invisibility, something I had underestimated for far too long. And yet she left traces. Small errors, minor inconsistencies in names and dates. She hadn't completely erased her past, and that was my advantage. I copied every address, every registration, every casual mention of her name. I traced her movements like a careful map, connecting dots across states: Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston. Each city was a step closer, a thread unraveling the tapestry she had woven so carefully. But fear never left me. Every time I got close, I felt it like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The thought of confronting her again, the woman who had shattered my family, was terrifying. What if she recognized me? What if she struck before I could act? I had spent so many years preparing, yet nothing could erase the adrenaline spike that ran through me whenever I saw her shadow, even from a distance. I also learned something about myself in those days. Patience was now my ally. In Boston as a child, I had acted impulsively, driven by panic and raw emotion. In Atlanta, I realized that raw emotion would only play into her hands. I had to wait. I had to observe. I had to let her mistakes accumulate until she was vulnerable. The understanding that life's battles are often fought quietly, that strategy, patience, and careful observation can outweigh brute force or immediate action. The nights in Atlanta were quiet, almost oppressively so. I would sit in my small motel room, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound, and pore over my notes. Maps of Boston, Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, all carefully labeled, tracking her every known move. My mind constantly replayed the night she struck my father, the weight of his body in my arms, his whisper of warning. That memory was no longer just pain. It was my fuel, my compass, my reason for staying relentless. I realized that Melanie had become predictable, despite her cunning. Certain patterns emerged. Small towns, brief stints at jobs, charity work, a fascination with older people she could manipulate. She had underestimated my resolve. She thought 2 decades would erase me. She thought I had given up. But every night as I traced her steps, I reminded myself that the United States is vast, yes, but nowhere in this country could she hide forever. And then one evening something happened that made my pulse jump. A neighbor mentioned seeing a woman matching her description walking near Piedmont Park. They hadn't known who she was, just remembered the way she carried herself. Graceful, assured, untouchable. I knew instantly. This was my chance. My first real opportunity to see her up close again. I didn't act rashly. I watched from across the street, heart-pounding, notebook in hand. Every movement she made was catalogued. Every gesture, every glance. I had spent years imagining this moment, but nothing could prepare me for the emotional punch of actually seeing her alive, laughing, walking as if she had never destroyed a life. And in that moment a quiet thought settled in my mind. Fear would no longer control me. Pain would no longer paralyze me. Melanie Wade had underestimated one thing. I had survived. I had studied. I had grown. And now I was coming for her. Have you ever tracked someone, knowing they had wronged you, and felt fear mixed with anticipation? Atlanta was only the beginning. Every time I retraced her steps, every time I spoke to someone who had seen her, the enormity of what she had taken hit me in waves I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just property or money. It was my father's legacy, my family's safety, and the innocence of my youth. Every small discovery felt like another weight pressing down on me, threatening to crush the resolve I had spent decades building. I remember sitting in a quiet cafe near Midtown, the hum of conversation around me blending into white noise as I pored over the papers I had gathered. Bank statements, property deeds, old business ledgers, photographs, a trail of destruction. Each document revealed how meticulously Melanie had dismantled my father's life, piece by piece, across the country. She had started small, forging signatures, redirecting payments, manipulating contracts. Then she escalated, closing businesses, selling properties, making my father's reputation crumble in the eyes of clients, neighbors, and even law enforcement. Every act was calculated, every betrayal precise. And I realized with a cold certainty that she hadn't just stolen things, she had stolen our very ability to trust the world. I traced her movements next to Savannah, Georgia, and then Charleston, South Carolina. The cities, though beautiful in their own ways, became hunting grounds. I drove long stretches of highway at night, the only light from my headlights cutting through the darkness, my mind replaying the night my father had fallen. I imagined her smiling, moving as if she had no past, while I carried decades of grief and fury with me. Every time I got close, I spoke to people she had interacted with, old neighbors, former colleagues. Even a woman at a small Savannah bakery who had unknowingly cashed a check Melanie had written in someone else's name. I listened carefully, asking subtle questions, recording details in my notebook. Older listeners will recognize that patient observation, quiet investigation, and careful listening often uncover truths that force confrontations later. I remember sitting alone in a Charleston hotel room one night, watching the moonlight reflect off the harbor, and thinking about what Melanie had done. She had not only taken my father's business and home, but she had taken something far more insidious: my sense of safety, my belief in kindness, my trust in others. The more I pieced together, the more enraged I became, but also the more methodical. I couldn't allow emotion alone to guide me. She had used emotion, trust, and manipulation to destroy lives. I had to be smarter, faster, and more careful than she could ever imagine. It was during these long nights of research that I stumbled upon a clue I hadn't expected. A small charity in Charleston where she had volunteered for several months. They remembered her, not as Melanie Wade, of course, but as a woman with an impeccable resume, charisma, and charm that belied her deceitful nature. Older audience members will relate to this kind of social subtlety, how some people can hide behind warmth while wreaking havoc on lives. I realized something crucial. Melanie had always targeted older people, those she assumed would not challenge her or follow her trail. It was a pattern I hadn't noticed as a child but became painfully clear now. She exploited trust and patience, just as she had exploited my father. That revelation fueled something in me, anger, yes, but also clarity. I began keeping a mental map of her patterns. Cities, neighborhoods, social circles, even restaurants she frequented. If she was clever, she would be planning her next move, unaware that someone had been quietly following her every step for decades. My resolve hardened. I was no longer just Evelyn, the girl who had lost her father. I was Evelyn, the hunter. And yet there were moments of fear I could not ignore. Every time I imagined confronting her, I felt a chill run through me. What if she saw me coming? What if she struck before I could act? These thoughts were constant companions, but they didn't stop me. I learned to carry them quietly like a loaded gun, always present, but only used when necessary. The tension between fear and determination, the patience required to pursue justice over years, and the knowledge that vengeance is not an impulsive act but a careful, deliberate one. I also began seeing the personal cost of her theft. My father's friends, now elderly, spoke of his downfall with sadness in their eyes. I met a former client in Charleston who remembered the Boston Furniture Store. A small, warm place filled with handcrafted pieces, laughter, and trust. She had burned that down. Every interaction with these people reminded me that what Melanie had stolen wasn't just mine. It had impacted everyone who had touched my family. It was during one of these encounters that I realized something essential. Revenge isn't just about taking back what was lost. It's about restoring truth. It's about making the world acknowledge what was done, and ensuring it doesn't happen again. That realization shifted my perspective. I didn't just want to confront her. I wanted to ensure that no one else could fall victim to the same pattern of deceit. By the time I left Charleston, my notebook was full, my mind sharper than it had ever been, and my determination unshakable. I had tracked her movements through Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, and with every city, every clue, every witness, I had come closer to understanding her. She had underestimated me for too long, and I knew deep in my bones that the next time I saw her, I wouldn't be the frightened girl from Boston. I would be the woman who had spent years studying, observing, and preparing. I would be the one who had grown stronger with every mile traveled, every lie uncovered, and every life she had touched in her path of destruction. Have you ever realized that someone who betrayed you didn't just hurt you, but hurt everyone around you? By the time I left Charleston, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Every city I had visited, every lead I had followed, had brought me closer to Melanie Wade. But it had also made one thing abundantly clear. She knew how to survive, and she had learned to anticipate the movements of anyone who dared chase her. I began noticing patterns in her behavior, small errors that revealed more about her than she realized. She moved quickly between states, rarely staying in one place for more than a few months. She had a network of people she used to cover her tracks. Landlords, co-workers, strangers unwittingly complicit in her schemes. Each interaction was calculated, each move deliberate. But she had one weakness, and it was a crucial one. She never fully erased the past. Something, whether vanity, overconfidence, or simple human error, always gave her away. I first realized the danger I was in Savannah. Walking the streets near the riverfront, I had been following a lead from a small local cafe, a tip from an elderly man who remembered seeing her months earlier. My instincts told me she might be nearby, and I was right. I caught a glimpse of her reflection in a store window, a flash of recognition that made my heart stop. My pulse thundered in my ears. For the first time since Boston, I felt truly hunted, except this time I was not the predator yet. I ducked into a narrow alley, pressed my back against the brick wall, and waited, watching. She never seemed to notice me, but I could feel it. The tension in the air, the way my muscles coiled. The awareness that she was a force I could not underestimate. Every step she took, every casual glance, carried the potential for danger. The awareness that danger can lurk in everyday spaces, that someone who seems ordinary may hold unimaginable power, and that patience is as crucial as courage. I followed her movements through the city for several days, careful not to reveal myself, careful not to act rashly. I interviewed everyone I could. Cafe owners, neighbors, even the local post office clerk who had seen her regularly. Each piece of information was a puzzle piece, slowly forming a map of her daily life. But the closer I got, the more I realized that she was aware of someone watching, though not me specifically. And then the first close call happened. I was walking down Bull Street, notebook in hand, when I felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply, and for a heartbeat our eyes met. Not Melanie's eyes, but someone watching me with keen interest. A man, tall, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase, and staring in a way that made my blood run cold. He didn't speak, didn't approach, but the message was clear. Someone was watching me, and he wasn't ordinary. I ducked into a nearby store, heart hammering, and tried to calm myself. My mind raced. Had Melanie noticed me? Was this part of her network? Or was it coincidence? Every instinct I had screamed danger, and I knew then that my hunt had reached a new level. This wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about survival. That night, in a small motel room overlooking the Savannah River, I pored over my notes again. Every lead, every interaction, every city she had visited. I realized that Melanie wasn't just cunning, she was escalating. She had learned from Boston, from Atlanta, from Savannah. And she was prepared to do anything to stay ahead. But so was I. I began planning my approach with military-like precision. I mapped out her likely routes, the locations she frequented, the people she might trust. Every conversation I had, every observation was carefully documented. I knew that the next encounter could be dangerous, possibly lethal. And yet, the thought of stopping now was inconceivable. The rage, the grief, the memory of that night in South Boston. All of it pushed me forward. The balance of fear and determination, the careful calculation required when confronting danger, and the realization that survival depends on strategy and patience. The days in Savannah blurred together. I ate at the cafes she frequented, walked the same streets, watched the same riverfront parks. And then one evening I saw her, truly saw her. Across a crowded market square, she moved with the same grace, the same calculated calm that I remembered from Boston. She was unaware of my presence, and yet I could feel the invisible tension in the air. The inevitability of our paths crossing again. I didn't approach. Not yet. But I made a promise to myself. The next time I would be ready. Every lie she had told, every life she had manipulated, every betrayal she had orchestrated, she would answer for it. I spent that night reviewing every detail, writing down observations, potential risks, and strategies. I realized that the pursuit was no longer just about revenge, it was about justice. It was about ensuring that a life like hers, capable of destroying so many, could not continue unchecked. By the end of my time in Savannah, I had a clear understanding of what I needed to do next. The chase would take me further south, deeper into the southeast, and eventually across the country. Melanie Wade had underestimated me for decades, and she would continue to do so until the moment I confronted her. But by then, I would be ready, not just for confrontation, but for the reckoning that had been years in the making. Have you ever sensed danger before it arrived? What did you do? The night air in Savannah was thick with humidity, the river reflecting the glow of distant streetlights like molten gold. I had spent the day tracing Melanie's steps, speaking with neighbors who remembered her from months prior, and visiting the charity she had volunteered at. Each detail brought me closer, each observation built a mental map of her life, but it also brought an awareness that the closer I got, the more dangerous it became. I had learned one unshakable truth. Melanie Wade thrived on control. She didn't make mistakes in public, didn't reveal her intentions, didn't falter. But she did underestimate people. And after 20 years of studying her, I was no longer the scared girl from South Boston. I was Evelyn, the one who had rebuilt herself from fragments of a stolen life, hardened by grief, sharpened by years of observation and patient planning. I followed a lead to a small, dimly lit cafe tucked in the historic district. Locals called it a gem of the city, quiet, cozy, filled with the aroma of roasted coffee and warm bread. And there she was, sitting at a corner table, her face partially obscured by shadows. The sight of her stole my breath for a moment. The woman who had destroyed my family, who had stolen my father's legacy, my trust, my childhood. She sat there as if nothing had happened. I approached slowly, careful not to draw attention. My mind raced. Every step felt weighted, heavy with the gravity of what I was about to do. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was preparing to confront a ghost from my past, a person whose influence had spanned decades of pain. And then it happened, the first near confrontation. She looked up, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. That glance carried everything. Recognition, calculation, a spark of curiosity. It was brief, subtle, but electric. I felt my pulse spike, my palms sweat, my heart hammering against my ribcage. For a moment, time froze. She didn't move toward me, didn't speak, but I knew she had sensed me, even if she hadn't placed me fully in context yet. I ducked behind a pillar, pressing my notebook to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to hide, to wait, but I refused. This was the moment I had trained for in my mind for years. I had studied her patterns, memorized her mannerisms, cataloged every interaction she had ever had. And yet, the reality was more intense than any imagined confrontation. For hours I observed from a distance. I watched the subtle twitch of her fingers as she sipped coffee, the way her eyes scanned the room, the way she tilted her head when someone approached her. Every movement was deliberate, careful, precise. She was the predator I had feared, and now I was the hunter. The awareness that confronting someone who has caused immense harm requires strategy, patience, and nerves of steel. It's not just about courage. It's about preparation, observation, and understanding the stakes. That night, I retreated to a small hotel overlooking the river. I spread out my notes, maps, and photographs across the table. I reviewed every detail, every interaction, every clue I had collected over the years. And then I began to formulate a plan, step by step, contingency by contingency. If Melanie had built her life on manipulation and deceit, I would build mine on precision, patience, and careful execution. Sleep was elusive. Every shadow outside the window, every distant noise, set my nerves on edge. I imagined her walking the streets, unaware that someone had been silently following her for decades. I imagined her reacting if she realized the scope of my preparation. And I imagined the moment when our paths would finally cross in a confrontation that neither of us would forget. In the quiet hours before dawn, I realized something important. Fear had transformed into focus. The memory of my father's blood-stained shirt, the echo of that gunshot, the whisper of betrayal, all of it had become fuel. I was no longer a victim. I was a force, tempered by years of planning and observation. The next morning I returned to the cafe, careful to remain inconspicuous. I watched her leave, noting the route she took, the places she frequented afterward. Every step she took was catalogued, mapped, and analyzed. I began to see patterns emerging, predictable habits, subtle vulnerabilities. This knowledge was power, and I was beginning to wield it. By the end of that day, I had refined my plan. The confrontation would not be rash or impulsive. It would be deliberate, calculated, and precise. I knew where she lived now, the people she trusted, the routines she relied on. I had patience, strategy, and time, advantages she had not anticipated. The patience required to seek justice, the observation needed to protect oneself, and the understanding that revenge is not immediate but a measured, deliberate act. As I lay awake that night, Staring at the ceiling of the hotel room, I whispered a vow. The next time we meet Melanie Wade, I will not hesitate. You stole my father, my family, my life, but I will take back what is mine. You will answer everything. And for the first time in decades, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The storm of fear, grief, and rage was still there, but it had been harnessed, focused, sharpened. The first near confrontation had passed, but the real reckoning was coming. Have you ever faced someone from your past who caused immense pain and had to stay calm while planning your next move? After the near confrontation in Savannah, I knew things had changed. Melanie Wade, now Marlene Wyatt, was no longer invisible. Something in the air had shifted. I could feel it in every street I walked, every cafe I entered, every interaction I had with people who knew her. She had begun to sense that someone was following her, watching her, cataloging her every move. I left Savannah before she could identify me. My next destination was Charlotte, North Carolina. The drive was long, winding along highways that stretched for miles through forests and small towns. The radio played faintly in the background, static between stations, and the rhythmic hum of the tires against asphalt became a kind of meditation. I thought about the path I had traveled, the decades of searching, the miles of investigation, the countless small clues that had led me here. Every moment, every step, had been preparation for this confrontation. Charlotte was a city of contradictions. Modern skyscrapers glinting in the sun, historic brick streets lined with trees and antique shops. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts, using the anonymity of a quiet neighborhood to plan my next moves. Melanie was clever, but she had made subtle mistakes, leaving traces of her presence, underestimating the patience of the person she had wronged. I have been patient for 20 years. I would continue to be patient for 20 more if necessary. The first days in Charlotte were slow. I watched from a distance, noting her routines. The way she walked to a small boutique each morning, the coffee shop she frequented, the park benches she lingered on. Each action, no matter how mundane, became a piece of a puzzle. I began to understand her psychology in ways I hadn't before. She was meticulous, calculating, always considering perception. But she had blind spots, tiny ones invisible to most, but glaringly obvious to someone who had spent decades studying her. I started leaving subtle markers in my observations. Photos taken from a distance, notes on her interactions, even recording small conversations she didn't know I could overhear. Older audiences will relate to the satisfaction of using intelligence, patience, and careful observation to gain an edge over someone more dangerous. It wasn't just about tracking her. It was about understanding her completely. Then the first sign that she had begun to sense me appeared. A neighbor in one of the apartment complexes where she had stayed mentioned seeing a woman watching her from across the street. She didn't know who it was, but she remembered the intensity of the gaze. My heart skipped a beat. Melanie had never been observed this way before, not by me directly, but by others. She was beginning to feel the pressure, the presence of someone who would not rest until justice was served. I knew that my pursuit had moved from covert observation to a psychological game. Every step I took, every place I visited, was calculated to remain invisible, while still gathering enough information to anticipate her next move. I became attuned to small details. The slight shift in her posture when she thought no one was watching, the patterns of her social interactions, even the rhythm of her speech when nervous. Every observation was a weapon. One evening I saw her at a small art gallery downtown. She moved gracefully among the paintings, but something in her expression had changed. Her eyes scanned the room more carefully, she lingered less on conversations, and I caught a fleeting glance in my direction, just enough to know that she was aware someone was on her trail. The game had changed. This wasn't a simple pursuit anymore. It was a duel of minds, a battle of patience and cunning. I retreated to my motel afterward, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had completely mapped her movements and anticipated her reactions. Every move I had made in Boston, Atlanta, Savannah, and Charleston had prepared me for this stage. Now in Charlotte I could feel the psychological tension building, the anticipation almost unbearable. That night I walked along the quiet streets, thinking about my father, the night she took him from me, and the years of planning that had brought me here. The humidity clung to my skin, the streetlights casting long shadows, the distant hum of traffic a constant reminder of the world moving on around me. And yet, nothing moved in my life. Everything had been paused, frozen until I could confront her and take back what had been stolen. I began drafting a detailed plan, considering every possibility, every contingency. What if she fled again? What if she realized the extent of my knowledge? What if she tried to strike first? I wrote it all down, mapping routes, exits, safe points, and potential traps. I realized that the next stage of the pursuit wouldn't be just about finding her. It would be about anticipating her every move, predicting her reactions, and staying one step ahead at all times. The understanding that long-term pursuit of justice requires strategy, patience, and mental fortitude. It's not a race. It's a test of endurance, resilience, and intelligence. As the days in Charlotte wore on, I noticed a pattern emerging. Melanie's movements were becoming more erratic, less predictable. She was aware of pressure and instinctively, she began testing boundaries, changing routines, attempting to mislead anyone who might be following her. But these small errors, the cracks in her facade, became my advantage. I realized then that the psychological tension was no longer just mine. She was reacting to my presence, feeling the invisible weight of observation. Our cat-and-mouse game had begun in earnest, and I understood something crucial. The hunt was no longer a solitary pursuit of discovery. It was a duel, a battle of wits, and the stakes were higher than ever. That night, as I sat in my motel room overlooking the quiet city streets, I made a promise to myself. The next encounter would be controlled. It would be deliberate. I would draw her out, anticipate her reactions, and take back the life she had stolen. I had prepared for decades, and now, the moment of psychological confrontation was approaching. Charlotte had been a city of patience, observation, and subtle pressure. I had traced every movement Melanie, now Marlene Wyatt, had made, noted every habitual pause, every slight twitch, every familiar street she preferred. And yet, nothing prepared me for the moment our paths collided directly, for the weight of her presence, for the emotional storm that came with seeing the woman who had shattered my family, standing so close, so unguarded. It was a late afternoon, the sky overcast with the heavy gray clouds of early spring. The streets were quiet, the shops just beginning to close, the occasional hum of traffic echoing softly down the brick-paved avenues. I had followed her to a small upscale bookstore tucked into a corner of Charlotte's historic district. It was the kind of place older patrons loved. Tall, narrow rows of old wooden shelves, the faint aroma of aged paper, the muffled whispers of people seeking solace in stories. She moved through the aisles with the calm precision I remembered from Boston, from Atlanta, from Savannah. Every gesture was practiced, deliberate, masking the person beneath the mask. I felt a familiar twist in my chest, a mix of fear, anger, and anticipation. My hands were steady, but my heart raced. I had waited 20 years for this moment. I approached cautiously, keeping a few shelves between us, every step measured. My mind catalogued every detail. The way her shoulders moved, the way she paused at the same row of books twice before selecting a novel, the subtle twitch in her wrist when she realized she had been holding a hardcover upside down. These small imperfections told me more than any confession ever could. They revealed her humanity, her vulnerability, and her arrogance. Then it happened. Our eyes met across the aisle. Time slowed. I could see recognition flash in her eyes, a flicker of something she had not expected. Fear, perhaps, or surprise, or a fleeting calculation. She masked it instantly with her usual charm, but it was there. I felt a jolt, the kind that goes straight to your gut, and I realized in that moment that the hunt was no longer my secret. She knew someone was watching, someone who had waited, someone who had planned. "Evelyn," she said softly, her voice calm but sharp, almost amused. The name felt heavy on my tongue. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for years, yet hearing it aloud sent a shiver down my spine. She smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been looking for you," I said, keeping my voice steady, measured. Her smile widened just slightly, the kind of smile that suggested she had been expecting this day in some corner of her mind, though she had never truly believed it would come. "Have you now?" she replied. Her tone was deceptively light, but I could feel the tension beneath it, like a taut wire ready to snap. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the quiet hum of the bookstore fading into the background. Every detail of her, the way she held herself, the faint scent of her perfume, the confident tilt of her chin, was a reminder of everything she had taken from me. And yet, I noticed something else. A crack in her composure, almost imperceptible. Perhaps she had not realized just how prepared I was, how focused, how relentless. I stepped closer, careful not to provoke a reaction too soon. "Do you remember Boston?" I asked quietly. "Do you remember that night?" Her expression didn't change outwardly, but I could see her mind racing. I had expected this. She was calculating, trying to assess whether I was bluffing, whether I had information, whether I was dangerous. But she could not hide the flicker of recognition, the faint tightening of her jaw. "That night," she began, her voice measured, almost rehearsed, "you were just a child. You had no idea what you were dealing with." "No," I said firmly, my voice low, controlled. "I had no idea what you were capable of. But I've spent 20 years learning, watching, and planning. And now I know everything. I know the lies, the manipulation, the destruction you caused. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." She tilted her head, studying me like one studies a puzzle, weighing her options. "And what do you plan to do with all that knowledge?" she asked. There was no mockery in her tone. Just calculation, anticipation. I stepped even closer, the books between us acting as both barrier and witness. "I plan to make you accountable," I said. "Everything you stole, every life you touched, every lie you told. I'm going to make it right. Starting with you." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You think you can control this? You think you can take me down?" I met her gaze without flinching. "I don't think so. I know. Because I've been patient. I've been strategic. I've followed your trail across states, decades of deception. And now you cannot escape me." The tension in the air was almost tangible. Every other patron in the bookstore seemed a distant blur, the world reduced to the two of us, locked in this silent, deadly dance. I could feel my pulse in my temples, my fingers itching with anticipation, my entire body alive with the culmination of years of pain, rage, and meticulous planning. For a moment she laughed softly, not the cruel, carefree laugh I remembered, but a controlled, calculating chuckle. "You've changed," she said. "No longer the scared girl from Boston. But do you think courage alone will be enough?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Courage isn't enough. Strategy, patience, intelligence, that's what will win. And I've spent 20 years building all three." Her gaze hardened, and for the first time, I felt the shadow of fear in her eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The woman who had seemed untouchable, who had manipulated, destroyed, and deceived with impunity, was realizing that the game had changed. We circled each other metaphorically, trading words, measuring reactions, calculating moves. Every phrase, every glance, every shift in posture was part of a silent chess game. Each move deliberate, high stakes, carrying the weight of 2 decades of history. And then she moved, just a step, almost imperceptible, a test of my reaction. My body tensed. My years of preparation kicked in. I anticipated, countered, and maintained my position. The psychological battle was on. The knowledge that confrontation is never just physical. It is emotional, psychological, and strategic. The stakes are not just victory, but validation, justice, and the reclamation of what was stolen. By the time we parted that evening, the bookstore emptied, leaving only the two of us and the silent witness of rows of books. The first confrontation had ended without violence, but it was decisive. I had seen the cracks in her armor. I had seen the fear she thought she hid. And she had seen the relentless focus of someone who had been wronged for decades, and would not rest until justice was served. I walked out into the quiet Charlotte streets, my notebook heavy in my hand, my mind racing with strategies, contingencies, and possibilities. The hunt had escalated. The psychological game had intensified. And the first direct confrontation had proven something vital. Melanie Wade, no matter how clever, was not invincible. I whispered to the night, the words carried on the breeze. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. And when the reckoning comes, you will answer for every life you've touched." The chase had taken me across cities, across states, and through decades of pain, fear, and preparation. From Boston to Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, and Charlotte, every mile had been a step closer to Melanie Wade, Marlene Wyatt, the woman who had shattered my family, my trust, my life. And now the time has come. The reckoning I had imagined for 20 years was no longer just a fantasy. It was real, palpable and imminent. Charlotte had been the stage for our first confrontation, and it revealed something critical. Melanie was human. She was clever, yes, manipulative, ruthless, but vulnerable. And I had spent 20 years transforming my pain into preparation, my grief into strategy, my fear into relentless focus. The scales had shifted. I tracked her to a small estate on the outskirts of Raleigh, North Carolina, a place she had chosen for its privacy, far from prying eyes. The mansion was modest in appearance, cloaked in the shadows of tall pines, but the weight of history, the countless lives she had manipulated, deceived, or destroyed, hung around it like a heavy fog. I approached cautiously, knowing that any misstep could be fatal. My years of patience, observation, and strategy had taught me the value of caution. I surveyed every entrance, every window, every path leading to the property. Melanie had learned from experience, but I had learned from decades of loss and preparation. Finally, I entered through the back gate, silent as the night. The cool air smelled of pine and damp earth. My footsteps were careful, deliberate, as I navigated the shadows. Every instinct, every training, every moment of preparation culminated in this single night. The reckoning was at hand. Inside she was waiting, or at least she knew I would come. I could feel it before I saw her, the tension in the air, the silent acknowledgement that the hunter and the hunted had finally come face to face. Our eyes met across the dimly lit room, the distance between us charged with decades of unresolved pain. "You've been very patient," she said, her voice calm but edged with caution. "But patience alone won't undo the past." I stepped closer, keeping my movements deliberate, my voice steady. "I don't need to undo the past. I need to make sure it never happens again. And I need to ensure that you answer for everything. Every lie, every betrayal, every life you've destroyed." Her face hardened. "And what makes you think you can do that? After all these years, after all the miles, all the chasing, you still think you can control the outcome?" I met her gaze without flinching. "Control isn't the point. Justice is. And justice doesn't wait. Not anymore." For the next hour we circled each other, verbally sparring, trading psychological blows. She tried to manipulate, to gaslight, to assert her dominance, but I was ready. Every tactic she used I anticipated. Every lie she told, I countered with facts, memories, and the accumulated evidence of decades. The mansion, once a fortress for her deception, became the arena for accountability. At one point she lunged, not violently, but with a sudden sharp movement meant to intimidate. My training, my focus, my years of preparation kicked in. I held my ground, my hands steady, my words precise. "You will not scare me. You underestimated me once, and you will not do it again." Her composure faltered for the first time in decades. I saw fear flash in her eyes, quick but undeniable. And in that moment I realized something crucial. The reckoning was not just about confrontation, it was about reclamation. I wasn't just reclaiming what was stolen. I was reclaiming myself. The culmination of patience, strategy, and resilience. The long journey from victimhood to empowerment. The satisfaction of confronting someone who has caused decades of harm. Finally, I handed her a file, meticulously organized evidence, documents, witness statements, and records from Boston to Charlotte. "It's all here," I said. "The truth. You cannot deny it. And now it's time to face it." Her face paled as she leafed through the papers. There was no charm, no deflection, only a dawning understanding that her years of deception had ended. The moment was heavy, charged with decades of emotion. Rage, grief, relief, and the quiet satisfaction of finally seeing justice within reach. I realized that the fight wasn't just about revenge. It was about closure, accountability, and the reclamation of life stolen. I left the mansion that night under the cover of darkness, the weight on my shoulders lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead was still long. There would be legal processes, consequences, and rebuilding. But I had faced the person who had haunted my life, and I had not wavered. If you've ever felt wronged, betrayed, or silenced, remember, patience, preparation, and courage can reclaim your power. Life may test you, but it can also prepare you for your reckoning. Stand firm, be vigilant, and trust that justice, however delayed, can be claimed. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and stay connected, because stories of resilience, justice, and courage are worth preserving, no matter your age.